All right. Welcome to Divorce Happy Hour Live. My name is John Nachlinger. I am one of the co-owners of Netsquire. And as we do every Friday at 12:30, I'm here to bring you some knowledge about divorce in New Jersey. So today we're going to talk about child support. Now, child support is one of those topics that everyone wants to know about because it's really important from the standpoint of you need the support for your kids. So a lot of people want to know, how is it calculated? What's included in child support? What's not included in child support? What does it all mean? So let's just kind of start at the beginning, like sort of what is child support supposed to be about? Well, child support is supposed to cover certain expenses for the children. Now, those expenses can be everything from just the roof over their head to the food that they eat to the clothes that they wear. So, child support is supposed to cover all of the essentials that a child needs. But there are limits. There are things that are not included in child support. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what those things are, what is included in child support, so that you have a better idea whenever you're looking at that number, what does it cover? And I think that it's very much something that people get very confused about because it's not all black and white. And those of you that listen to our podcast understand that divorce is not black and white. Since divorce is not black and white, a lot of times we have to speak in generalities and we have to speak in ways that that make sense so that everyone's on the same page. So let's talk back about how we get to child support, how it's calculated. The first thing that you have to do is determine what the parenting schedule is going to be. And what we mean by that is how many overnights a child or children is going to be with each parent. And an overnight, you might think is, okay, it's wherever a child sleeps at night. Not so. A overnight is what's considered a 12-hour day, the majority of a 24-hour day. So 12 hours plus a minute is an overnight. Now, of course, usually that means somebody is sleeping over at someone's house, but that's not always the case. For example, if you picked up your kids at 8 a.m. and dropped them off at 10 p.m., that would be an overnight because your kids are with you for 14 hours, which is the majority of a day. But for simplicity, we do just talk about the fact that an overnight is where the kids sleep. Okay. So the first thing you have to do before we even get to the point of calculating child support is how many overnights is a child with both parents. So that's the first thing you have to do. And that's where a lot of people have the fight, because if you have to determine the parenting time schedule before you can calculate support, sometimes people are very much aware of the fact that the more time they give their kids, the less support they might pay, or the more time they give their kids, the more support they might receive. So it's very important before we even get into the calculation that you figure out what the parenting schedule is going to be. You should really try to do that in isolation away from money, because the parenting schedule really should be what's best for the children. And so that's why you have to start there. So once you decide what the schedule is, and this is the regular schedule, all right? What I mean by that is if you take your kids on vacation or you're alternating holidays, none of that goes into the calculation. Because if you're alternating years, there's sort of this expectation that every 2 years, those times that you're going to have with your kids will sort of even themselves out. So really all we're looking at is the regular parenting schedule. So if you've got a schedule where mom has Monday and Tuesday, dad has Wednesday and Thursday, and then you're alternating Friday through Sunday, and it's a 50-50 schedule, then each person's going to have exactly the same number of overnights during the year. And so that's what we do first. Second thing we do is we look at the incomes of the parties. Now, sometimes it's pretty easy, right? If you've got a W-2 income, we're just going to take your income. and we're going to put it into our calculation. If you have if you're self-employed or you get a 1099 or something like that, it can be a little bit more complicated. But we have to figure out what your income is going to be, whatever it is. And we put those numbers into our guidelines. Now, sounds pretty easy, right? Where does it get complicated? Well, number one, when someone isn't working or someone's not working as much as they should, maybe they're working part-time. If those things happen, then that can create a problem, because now all of a sudden it's not easy. We don't have a W-2 income to use. So we have to figure out what the income is going to be. And usually that resolves in there being an imputation of income. And what we mean by imputation is we pretend like someone's making a certain level of income, even if they're not. So support would be based on someone's, let's say, making $40,000 a year, even though they're only making $15,000 a year. Because one of the things that's important is that both parents have to support their kids. Now, of course, there's some realistic parts to that, which is that we have childcare. So if you are forcing somebody to work full time, usually there's going to be a childcare component. And so sometimes it doesn't make sense, because if childcare for 2 kids is $1,500 or $2,000 a month, that's going to eat up a large part of someone's income. So that's a discussion that needs to be had. Typically, we like to do that in mediation to sort of look at people's incomes and what does it mean in reality? Does it mean that it makes sense for someone to work if we're just going to, have to pay $20,000, $25,000 a year in childcare? So once we decide what each person's income is, and that's something that you negotiate, if it's not clear, then we can start to do the calculation. A couple other little things about income. One is some people work a lot of overtime. And one of the things that's very popular to hear whenever someone starts a divorce is, well, I'm not going to be working any more overtime, or the overtime's over. I'm not going to be doing any more overtime. Unfortunately, if you have been working overtime during your marriage or before you start a child support calculation, or you receive bonuses on a regular basis, those will go into the calculation, right? It's not just your base salary, it is your total income. And if you're calculating child support between January and June 30th, then your child support will be based on your prior year W-2. So if your prior year W-2 says that you made $100,000, but $20,000 of that is overtime, then your income is going to be $100,000. And that's where you might be able to build in some automatic review if maybe your overtime isn't guaranteed. But most of the time, if you get overtime, you have access to it on a regular basis. Okay. So, and the same thing with bonuses. I mean, everyone says, well, my bonus is discretionary. I may or may not get my bonus. Well, okay, that's true. But that's where we could build in something that says, if you don't get your bonus, here's what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, if you regularly get a bonus, guess what? That's part of your income. So after June 30th, so July 1st through the end of the year, then we're looking at your year-to-date income. And that's where we'll look at your most recent W-2s, and we will calculate what your income is based on year-to-date. So depending on where you are in the year will depend on what it is that we're going to be using to look at your income. If you're self-employed, it gets a little bit more complicated, and we're going to be looking at what your reasonable income is after deducting expenses that are necessary for you to do your job. And I'm not going to get into that on this podcast, but we look and see what someone actually needs to deduct from their income in order for them to do this self-employment job that they have. And then once we put all the income in, there's certain deductions that can occur. The first deduction that occurs is if you have a mandatory pension contribution or retirement contribution. So there are people out there that have to contribute towards their retirement plan, whether they want to or not. Usually this is people that work for the government, or in the military, cops, firefighters, anyone where you must contribute to a pension whether you want to or not. So if it's mandatory, it comes out of your income. Another thing is if you have union dues. So if you're in a union and part of your job requires you to actually contribute towards union dues, those will come out of your income as well. And then finally, if you're paying alimony or receiving alimony, but right now we're going to talk about paying alimony to your soon-to-be ex-spouse, that will come out of your income. So that also will reduce your income. And then on the flip side, it will add to the income of your co-parent and your ex-spouse. So there's a bunch of different things that change the numbers. And the most important thing, it will be taxes. Now, what's interesting here is most of the time we do not actually even look at your pay stubs to look at how much you're withholding from your paycheck, because a lot of you withhold far too much from your paycheck. So the way our guidelines work is it just assumes the right amount that you're supposed to be withholding from your paycheck, not the amount that you actually withhold from your paycheck. Okay, so once we get all of that together, we have your net incomes. Now, your net incomes will add up to a total net income. And then when we look at your total net income, we'll figure out the percentages that each of you have. So it might be that the wife has 40% of the net income and the husband has 60% of the net income. Those percentages are important because we can use those percentages to divide extracurricular activities. We can use those percentages to divide unreimbursed healthcare expenses. We can even use those percentages to even talk about college expenses. So we can actually use those percentages in a lot of different ways. But once we decide what your total net income is, the state of New Jersey will tell us, depending on how many children you have, what the total cost is for those children. And then what we do is that amount of child support is then divided between the two parties. So using a simplistic number, if child support was $1,000 a month and husband makes 60% of the total income, child support would be $600 a month, right? It's pretty simplistic. Then the next thing that happens is there are various adjustments depending on how many overnights each person has. So once the overnights are put into the arrangement and there's a deduction for the overnights, particularly that each party has, then the final child support number will come out. And that is how we get to child support. Now, there's all kinds of additional things that could go into the formula. One is work-related childcare. You can split it equally, or it can go into the calculation. Another thing is premiums for health insurance. So one of the things you can do is put in the premium for health insurance, and then whoever's paying the premium would get a credit towards child support based on the amount that they're paying. So it's a formula that I just told you a bunch of different things that go into it. But the fact of the matter is it's not complicated. And if you have an experienced mediator or an attorney helping you, you can sort of go through all these factors in a way that makes sense. Really, fighting isn't something you really need to be doing here. Okay? So that's how we get to child support. And I just gave you like the quick version of child support, but at least that gives you an idea of the types of things that will go into the calculation. Now, what does child support cover? Child support covers the roof over your kids' heads, okay? It covers the food that they eat, both the groceries, eating out, and school lunch. It includes all of the food that they eat. It includes all their clothing. It includes the gas that you expend to drive your children around. It doesn't include getting a car for your kids. It just includes the cost to drive them around. All right. It includes entertainment for your kids. So, if your kids want to go see a movie or something like that, is included. Haircuts. It includes jewelry. It includes, hobbies, if they have any hobbies. It includes some extracurricular expenses, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So it includes all of these things that are pretty typical for a kid. Okay. Now, it doesn't include anything that's not typical for a kid. And what do I mean by not typical? It's typical for children to be involved in some lower cost extracurricular activity. Something that costs $200 or $300 a year. That's pretty typical. What's not typical is for children to be involved in very expensive extracurricular activities, like travel soccer or lacrosse or gymnastics, dance, something where the expense is quite large with lots of uniforms and costumes and all these things that have to be purchased. Now, is that what the law says? No, but the law isn't black and white when it comes to these sorts of things. Child support also covers the first $250 per child of unreimbursed healthcare expenses each and every year. So if you're receiving child support, you're going to be expected to pay the first $250 per year per child of unreimbursed healthcare expenses. After that, typically those healthcare expenses are divided by the percentages that we talked about earlier, which is just the proportionate to income, basically. Like I said before, childcare is not included in child support. So if there's work-related childcare, that needs to be split, or it needs to be included in the child support calculation. You can do one or the other. I'm a big fan of not including it in the child support calculation because that number changes all the time. And you really don't want to get in the habit of just putting it in there, because then you're going to have to constantly change child support. And college expenses are not included in child support. And in New Jersey, we're one of the few states where parents are required to contribute towards college expenses. And so that's not included in child support. And child support gets a little complicated too when we look at college, because sometimes you're duplicating expenses. If somebody is living at home, that's different than if they're living on campus. If they're living on campus, then you've got to figure out, well, what should child support be? Because if they're not at home all the time, then really it's not fair for child support to continue to be this high number. So, it sort of really depends. But when people look at child support and they're trying to resolve everything, most of the time we look at it from a more of a practical perspective of what things need to be divided. You know your children, you know what they're involved with. So what things need to be divided so that it's fair to both of the parties. Okay? That's really where you have to go. So child support, as you can see from this discussion, isn't terribly black and white, but it's also not difficult. Because if you can calculate the child support amount and you're not fighting with your spouse about the variables, like we're not fighting about how much money one makes or something like that, then it's really just about making sense of what we're going to share in terms of expenses. If your child's involved in dance, let's say dance, and you know that it costs a couple $1,000s a year between the trips and the monthly expenses and the uniforms and everything, the costumes and all those things, you need to split that. That's not going to be included in child support. But most of the time, people can agree that extracurricular activities are going to be split. Now, of course, what problem do we have all the time? People sign up their kids for everything without actually asking the other parent for permission. So that's a whole nother thing that you have to deal with, is making sure that you've got this permission. And then on top of all of that is interfering with the other parent's parenting time. So I raise all of these issues not to confuse you if you're listening to this, but just to point out how many issues have to be discussed and resolved in order to reach an agreement that is comprehensive, that actually deals with all of the different things that you need to resolve so that you and your co-parent don't fight. afterwards, which is really the goal. It's just not to have any fights. So it's very helpful to meet with a mediator to go through all of these issues one by one, find out what the two of you actually want so that your agreement can be comprehensive and that there's no gaps in your agreement. So you're not going to be having these fights in the future about what the intention was and what did you mean and all these other things. You want to have an agreement that is completely airtight and done so that once you're done with this process, you are done. I mean, I don't think any of you want to be coming back to court over and over again or contact an attorney over and over again when you could have just sat down with a mediator or somebody that can really go through each of these issues one by one and really help you make sense of everything. Now, child support is post alimony. So, what I mean by that is not only do you have to figure out what the parenting schedule is, you have to figure out whether or not there's going to be alimony before you can even calculate child support. So, whenever I talk to people and we start talking about what direction we should go, like how should we start discussing this, as much as I don't want to discuss money first, you have to figure out what alimony is going to be before you calculate child support. So if you're looking at this from a step-by-step perspective, the first thing you should do is try to figure out what the parenting schedule is going to be. The second thing you should do is figure out what alimony, if any, is going to be. And the third thing would be calculating child support. And that's sort of the sequence that you have to go in because of the way how everything depends on the thing before. So, alimony might depend on the parenting schedule to some degree, but both alimony and the parenting schedule are required to calculate child support. So that's sort of how it goes. So if you need help with mediation, you want to sit down with somebody, go through all the child support issues, we are here to help you. It's what makes us, gets us up in the morning. We really want to change the way people are getting divorced and really come at it from a holistic perspective and come at it from a perspective that makes a lot of sense and doesn't encourage you guys to fight. We don't want fighting because a lot of this isn't that complicated. And plus, when it comes to kids, things change all the time. So again, if you have any questions, reach out to us, direct message us. We are here for you. And do not forget to come back here every Friday at 12:30 for 30 minutes or less of a topic that will educate you and help you understand divorce a little bit better. We'll see everyone next week.